G'day. I noticed that some of these sim racing YouTubers are racking up impressive views on YouTube, so here I am to leech whatever attention I can from the same crowd. But seriously, yeah. Can I achieve better lap times with a more expensive setup for sim racing versus a much cheaper alternative, and are there any benefits if you have the money to spend? If you're just after a TLDR, then in my case the answer is yes, but some of the improvements came from areas such as comfort, which was actually quite a big one, and that sort of comes up later on in the video. But I would really appreciate it if you watch the video anyway. If you're just after the timestamps though, they will be linked in the description. But I just want to go over a couple of little things before I dig into the tasty meat of the video. Firstly, and probably most importantly to get across, is that expensive hardware doesn't automatically increase your skill. When it comes to sim racing, the fastest race carists will memorize the exact braking point for the perfect entry, the gears and speeds they can comfortably hit for each corner, the best ways and even locations to overtake, and many other gameplay aspects. It's always going to be constant practice that determines how good you are. Granted, some hardware may be so terrible that an upgrade to something is required, but skill is the biggest factor. I'm not going to win races without learning how to properly race a track and understand the nuances of the car I'm driving, regardless of how much money I put into the setup. But I understood all this before setting out and spending such a large chunk of money. I wasn't sure at first if there would be any major benefits that led to faster lap times, but the biggest thing for me was comfort and immersion. It just seemed like I would get way more enjoyment out of a proper setup. I just wanted to stress that point because I think it's easy for people to think a piece of hardware for anything can just make you better at a game when you still need the skill to go with that hardware. When it comes to the racing genre, I've definitely had a fair go. I've played a decent amount of V8 Supercars 2 and Gran Turismo 3, shitloads of Dirt 2 and Grid, some Dirt Rally 1 and 2, and then dabbled in other random titles over the years like Forza and some more arcade focused ones like Need for Speed or Burnout. In terms of proper sim racing though, I've had almost no exposure to it, so I'm an inexperienced racist in that regard. The reason I picked F1 2021 is it's the game that led me to getting a wheel in the first place and wanting to properly immerse myself into the genre. I played the game for about 20 hours with my Thrustmaster wheel and was relatively familiar with its handling, until I turned off the racing line, then it just becomes a whole new beast. I am well aware of its status as being more arcadey than sim though, but I figured I would keep something familiar for the video. ACC I started to learn because it seemed to never not be at or right near the top in lists of the best sim races. From what I've read and watched, it seems pretty common for the game to be the go-to sim if you want the best driving with the best graphics and sound. So long as you can tolerate only two car classes, them being GT3 and GT4. I personally can, so I was more than happy to start learning the game, and I've been really enjoying the journey so far. Just keep in mind, I'm still very new, so the times that you'll see in my laps aren't exactly going to turn any heads. Well, heads might turn away from the video. In terms of testing, I used the one track and car on each game for consistency for every session. I chose Austria for F1 with the standardized speeds across all cars, and Bathurst for ACC with the Aston Martin. On day one, I did a roughly 30-minute session on each game with my first wheel. Then a few days later, I did a second session of the same length, also with my first wheel. Finally, my third session wouldn't be until over a week later, close to 2 weeks later I believe it was, after I had all the new gear set up. I found it to be an interesting way to test if I still knew the tracks well, whilst also learning the feel of the new hardware. Not incredibly extensive testing, but I was more so curious about the immediate changes, if there were any. Last thing to quickly mention is the hardware. I started with a Thrustmaster T300 RS GT. This would be mounted on my desk with the clamp that comes with it, and the pedals just sat on the carpet. For seating, I have a pretty stock standard desk chair. Perfectly fine for longer gaming sessions, but a bit shit for racing. More on that later. Now, I have a Track Racer TR80 cockpit with a recliner chair that you can buy straight from them, which is quite handy. A Fanatec DD1 wheelbase, McLaren GT3 wheel, a Club Sport RS wheel for when I'm playing dirt, Fanatec shifter, and Fanatec CSL pedals with a load cell brake. Okay, now that's all out of the way, I'll start with F1 2021 and then move on to ACC. And towards the end, talk about some miscellaneous things. So starting off with F1, I picked Austria because it's one of my favorite tracks in the game, and chose my hot pink custom car because although red is the fastest color, Pink is the tastiest, if you know what I mean. I kept the car set up as standard because, to be honest, I have no idea what any of the settings actually do. Wing aero, camber, tires, front? I don't understand any of these words. Learning the track was key to this session, and pretty much all of my laps were just that. Learning how the track worked with this car, pushing that little bit further, waiting that little bit longer before hitting the brakes. It was mostly just trying to feel how I should drive the car to its full extent. By the end of the 30 minutes, I was already feeling discomfort with my setup and ended the session with a 1:07.258. Session 2, I noticed I had more confidence in my driving. I don't think I ever felt the need to look down at my map, which was a habit I noticed I still had throughout some of session 1. Although I spent a lot of time pushing the car way harder than I was supposed to and really fucking up some of the laps, there was a lot of fun to be had. But the confidence came from the fact that I felt like I was sort of understanding these corners better, understanding the braking and the feel of the car in general a bit better, and could recognize why a certain entry or even an exit from the corner wasn't as good as the last. But I just could not, for the life of me, replicate my speed on 2 sections in particular that I was just consistently slower at when it came to exiting from the corner. On my second last lap though, I shaved a small bit of time off to get a 1:07.186. Session 3 was with the new gear and a bit of a fair gap between playing any vroom vroom games at all. I had a lot of botched laps, not just because I was getting used to the new wheel and wheelbase because they have a bit of a different feel to them, but the brake pedal was something I had to get used to as well. For those who don't know, the load cell brake pedal applies varying levels of braking based on the force that you press into it and not the distance that the pedal travels itself. It was taking me way longer to feel out than I thought it would, but I persisted and eventually brought that time down to a 1:06.889. Even better though was bringing that a B-stick lower on the very next lap to a 0.880, only to do a third lap in a row and finish with a 1:06.673. So I not only had to remember braking points and the like over a couple of laps, but also feel how to apply this new hardware to my racing. But the new hardware felt smoother, more accurate, and boatloads more comfortable. Some adjustments could probably still be made, but I was comfortably sunk into the chair without any weird niggles in my back or awkward moments where I was trying to reposition the pedals with my feet like what happened with the Thrustmaster. Something else I noticed is that there seemed to be, I'm just going to steal Erman Hamadovich's explanation, more detail in the force feedback. It felt easier to tell if the car was being pushed too hard or not hard enough, which was a nice change from the Thrustmaster wheel where force feedback was nearly non-existent on this game specifically. When you started to hit certain degrees on the wheel, it would sort of stiffen up a little bit and smashing into walls would elicit a tiny bit of feedback, but that was pretty much it. The only other time a significant amount of force was ever felt was when the game would auto drive you out of the pits, and when control is given back to the player, the wheel suddenly goes for a split second. It still never felt like enough though, even with all the new hardware, and sometimes I would still spin out without any indication that traction was actually lost. That was a tad strange, and I was more so remembering specific speeds rather than relying on the feel of the car. Further tweaking of the settings in-game might actually be required. Righto, ACC. I genuinely think Mount Panorama is a terrific track. I promise I'm not just racing it because I'm an Aussie. As for the car, I just went with the Aston Martin because it looked nice. I appreciated how it looked and just went, yeah, fuck it, that'll do. I wasn't aware of any of the pros and cons between each car at this point. Setup, once again, remained standard because of all these strange terms like fuels and brake. This first session was only my second time racing this track in the game. I did a lap or two many weeks prior in a Ferrari maybe. For the most part, it was all fresh though. Right from the start, the force feedback was actually present in the Thrustmaster wheel. I could feel the dips in the road and the rattling of the car as it started to hit 200 plus Ks per hour, or 16.5 furlongs per minute for the barbarians at home not using the metric system. There were also moments I could actually feel the car slipping and was able to catch it. There was a more involved sense of participation, so I could more easily judge the outcome through how it was handling on certain corners. After literally grinding my face against the wall and finally doing some clean laps, I managed to hit a 209.642, and immediately followed that with a 209.486. Despite going in for a cheeky kiss with the wall, Session 2 was mostly a shit fight. I restarted multiple times, pushed the car way harder than I should have, missed braking points, it was just a mess. And then, out my ass, I pulled a better time. Somehow. 208.585. Almost a full second quicker than the last PB. Finally, Session 3. Some of the things with Session 3 for F1 carry over to here, such as relearning braking points and still trying to figure out how the new hardware interacted with the game. In-game force feedback had to be adjusted though. Where F1 still felt very light on the force, ACC's was so intense it was like doing a full-blown arm and shoulder workout just turning the first corner. Once that was fixed, I still had to get used to the new load cell brake. Eventually though, I got my better lap. A 207.755, nearly another second down. ACC was already feeling pretty good with the Thrustmaster, but just like F1, there was so much more detail in the driving through this new wheelbase. Even more so with ACC, due to the terrific work Kunos has done. Using the load cell brake was starting to feel so much more natural as well. Not to mention the McLaren wheel, which I find to be very comfortable as well. Which is a nice segue into the first of this miscellaneous section, comfort. I've already spoken a little bit about my issues with using the Thrustmaster on my desk, but I just want to stress how much better it is to have a cockpit. It's not even necessarily about having an expensive 80/40 rig like what I have, it's just really nice to sit in the exact position you're after and have everything be at a comfortable reach without feeling the need to adjust in the seat or move anything around. And as I said, even the increased comfort with the McLaren wheel helps make the experience more enjoyable. My hands fit nicely in it, and at no point even when making the tightest turns does it feel like a pain to use. In terms of the wheelbase itself, just to reiterate, there is now so much more smoothness in my turns and much more detail in the game being fed back to me. Quick movements in game feels like just turning an actual wheel, and the added stiffness with the Club Sport quick release and having everything bolted down just really brings it all together. So overall, it's not just better hardware getting me better results, it's a combination of better hardware with a massive increase in comfort that really puts me in the right place and the right mood to run consistent laps and spend longer learning the tracks in whatever game I'm playing. I could have potentially just done this with a cheaper rig in that regard and mounted the Thrustmaster wheel to it, but like I said at the beginning, I was after as much of a boost to immersion and fun as possible, and so far all this gear has managed to do just that. One last thing I want to touch on before ending the video is the setup and teardown process, if you want to call it that. The Track Racer took literal hours to piece together and adjust. It's easy to follow the instructions, but it's not necessarily an easy task to do, and some sections were clearly meant to be done by two people, but I'm a loser who lives alone, so I had to suffer through it, and that just added more time. But once it is done, it just sits there, waiting to be used at a moment's notice. Like your mum. The Thrustmaster though, well, anytime I wanted to use it, I would take it out from underneath the desk, clamp it on, plug in the USB, bring the pedals towards me and fiddle around with positioning because they never felt like they were in the right spot, plug those in, then kind of deal with some uncomfortable racing as my chair promotes a sort of straighter posture, sitting upright, and I kept having to kick my butt forward on the chair so I could resemble leaning back. Then when done, I would have to unplug the USB cable and pedals, undo the clamp, kick the pedals away from my feet and chuck the wheel under the desk. I was pretty over this process after only setting it up for the second time. So just a rig alone made this new endeavour of mine much more fun to continue doing. Because of this increased level of enjoyment, I've now also started getting into online racing. I had my first ACC race the other day, and even though everyone was way faster than me, it's just good to get out there and learn how to become a better race carer. I've even started with iRacing due to its reputation as being the go-to sim for multiplayer. If you would like, I could do a video where I go through my first races in those games, so be sure to let me know if you'd like to see that. So far I've seen some pretty good crashes. And just for the sake of it, even though no one will likely hear it, thank you to the many channels whose content has made me get into sim racing in the first place and stick with it and start learning it. Erman Ham Sandwich, Super GT, Boosted Media, Sim Racing Room, Carl Gosling, Sim Racing Garage, and Race Beyond Matter are the main people I've watched over the past few months who really showcase the enjoyment to be had in this hobby. Until the next video, have a good one.